Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while the world obsesses over military strength, economic sanctions, and trade wars, they're completely missing the most powerful form of international influence operating today? And what happens when everyone realizes that the ability to shape global policies, resolve conflicts, and build coalitions is not controlled by superpowers with the biggest armies or economies, but by one nation that has perfected the art of being trusted by everyone? Most people don't know that Canada has quietly become the world's most influential quiet power. We are the country that other nations call when they need honest mediation. We're the voice that carries weight in international forums, precisely because we don't shout. We've built a global reputation for reliability, fairness, and competence that gives us influence far beyond what our population or military budget would suggest. But here's what should reshape how we think about power. In a world of declining trust, being trusted is the ultimate superpower. This isn't just about diplomatic politeness or international goodwill. We're talking about the ability to influence trade agreements, climate policies, security arrangements, and global governance structures that affect billions of people and trillions of dollars. But here's the question that will define 21st century international relations. What happens when soft power becomes the hardest power of all? This is the story of how reputation, relationships, and strategic restraint are making Canada the invisible empire of global influence, and why the next world-changing agreement might be negotiated not in Washington or Beijing, but in a quiet conference room in Ottawa where everyone feels safe to tell the truth. Before we examine Canada's unique influence, we need to understand how dramatically international relations are shifting toward reputation-based power, and why traditional measures of national strength are becoming less relevant than credibility and trust. The numbers reveal the scope of the global trust crisis. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in government has declined in 26 of the 28 countries surveyed, with average trust levels falling to historic lows. Trust in international institutions, multinational corporations, and media has similarly declined across most developed nations. This trust crisis is creating new forms of international paralysis. Trade negotiations stall because parties don't believe each other's commitments. Climate agreements fail because countries doubt others will fulfill their promises. Security partnerships weaken because allies question each other's reliability and motivations. Traditional forms of international coercion are becoming less effective as their costs increase and their legitimacy declines. Military interventions face greater international opposition and domestic resistance. Economic sanctions often harm the countries imposing them as much as their targets. Diplomatic threats lose credibility when overused or ineffectively implemented. Meanwhile, complex global challenges increasingly require cooperative solutions that no single country can impose unilaterally. Climate change, pandemic response, financial stability, terrorism, and migration all require sustained cooperation between multiple nations with different interests and capabilities. The result is a global governance system that desperately needs honest brokers, trusted mediators, and reliable partners. Countries that can build and maintain trust have unprecedented opportunities to influence international outcomes through facilitation rather than coercion. This shift toward trust-based influence plays directly to Canada's historical strengths while neutralizing the traditional advantages of military and economic superpowers. Countries that rely primarily on hard power often find that their influence decreases rather than increases when trust becomes the critical currency of international relations. Now let's examine what Canada actually possesses in terms of international credibility and how our reputation translates into concrete influence over global policies and outcomes. Let's start with our track record in international mediation and conflict resolution. Canada has been involved in resolving more international disputes than any other middle power, with a success rate that far exceeds global averages for diplomatic mediation. The Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel might have been hosted by the United States, but Canadian diplomatic groundwork and ongoing mediation played crucial roles in making the agreement possible and sustainable. Canadian diplomats spent years building relationships with both sides and identifying potential compromises. In the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981, Canada's embassy in Tehran sheltered 6 American diplomats for months, coordinating their eventual escape through what became known as the Canadian Caper. This operation demonstrated Canadian reliability under pressure and our ability to take risks to support allies. The Ottawa Treaty, banning anti-personnel landmines, represents perhaps the clearest example of Canadian diplomatic leadership. When traditional powers were deadlocked on arms control, Canada brought together middle powers and civil society organizations to create an alternative negotiating process that achieved results. Traditional diplomacy could not. The responsibility to protect doctrine, which reshaped international law regarding humanitarian intervention, was largely developed through Canadian academic institutions and diplomatic initiatives. This doctrine has been invoked to justify international interventions in Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, and other humanitarian crises. Our role in creating and leading international institutions demonstrates another dimension of Canadian influence. Lester Pearson, his invention of modern peacekeeping earned him the Nobel Peace Prize and established principles that still guide international conflict resolution today. The Arctic Council, which manages cooperation in the rapidly changing Arctic region, was largely a Canadian initiative that brought together Arctic nations, including Russia, during periods of broader international tension. This institution demonstrates Canada's ability to create frameworks for cooperation, even in challenging geopolitical environments. The Cairns Group of Agricultural Trading Nations was formed under Canadian leadership to challenge agricultural protectionism in major economies. This coalition has influenced WTO negotiations and global agricultural trade policies far beyond what any single middle power could achieve independently. Our reputation for competent administration and fair dealing makes Canada a preferred host for international negotiations and conferences. When countries need neutral ground for sensitive discussions, they often choose Canadian cities because all parties trust our discretion and fairness. The USMCA renegotiation demonstrated how Canadian diplomatic skills can achieve favorable outcomes even when negotiating with much larger powers. Despite threats and pressure, Canada achieved a deal that protected key Canadian interests while maintaining essential trade relationships. To understand how this translates into practical influence, we need to look at specific policy areas where Canadian credibility creates opportunities to shape international outcomes and build coalitions. Climate policy represents one of the clearest examples of Canadian diplomatic influence exceeding our size. Despite being responsible for less than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, Canada has played outsized roles in shaping international climate agreements and policies. The Paris Agreement negotiations involved complex discussions between over 190 countries with vastly different economic interests and political systems. Canadian negotiators served as bridge builders between developed and developing nations, helping craft language and mechanisms that made the agreement possible. Our expertise in carbon pricing mechanisms, developed through domestic carbon tax policies, positioned Canadian negotiators as technical experts who could help other countries design and implement carbon pricing systems. This technical credibility translated into influence over global carbon market designs. The Montreal Protocol, which successfully addressed ozone depletion, was negotiated and signed in Montreal, partly because Canada was seen as a neutral host that could facilitate agreement between competing interests. Canadian technical expertise in atmospheric science also contributed to the scientific foundation for the agreement. International development assistance provides another area where Canadian approaches have influenced global policies. The Canadian International Development Agency pioneered integrated approaches to development that combined health, education, and economic development, rather than treating them as separate sectors. Canadian innovations in microfinance, community-based development, and Indigenous rights have been adopted by other donor countries and international organizations. The Canadian approach to development emphasizes local capacity building and long-term sustainability over short-term project outcomes. Our leadership in maternal and child health initiatives, particularly through the Muskoka Initiative launched during Canada's G8 presidency, mobilized billions of dollars in additional funding and established new international standards for maternal health programs. The Global Partnership for Education, which Canada helped establish and continues to support, has become the primary international mechanism for coordinating education assistance to developing countries. This initiative demonstrates how Canadian leadership can create institutions that outlast individual governments. Trade policy represents another domain where Canadian diplomatic skills achieve results beyond what our economic size would suggest. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the European Union was the most ambitious trade agreement the EU had negotiated at the time. CT. Negotiations required navigating complex European political systems, addressing concerns from multiple stakeholder groups, and crafting innovative solutions to regulatory differences. Canadian negotiators' reputation for competence and fairness helped build trust that enabled the agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations demonstrated Canadian ability to build coalitions and influence outcomes in complex multilateral trade talks. Even after the United States withdrew from TPP, Canada played a leading role in creating the CPTPP that preserved most of the original agreement's benefits. Our role in reforming the World Trade Organization shows how Canadian diplomatic leadership can address systemic challenges in international institutions. Canadian proposals for WTO reform focus on preserving multilateral trade rules while addressing concerns from both developed and developing countries. I want to pause here because this raises a crucial question about the nature of influence that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. In an era of rising authoritarianism and declining international cooperation, is Canada's emphasis on multilateralism and consensus building still effective? Or do we need to adopt more assertive approaches to protect our interests? This choice will define Canada's role in international affairs for decades and could affect everything from trade relationships to security arrangements. What's your perspective on how Canada should use our international influence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Beyond specific policy achievements, Canada's influence operates through less visible but equally important channels that shape how international cooperation functions and how global problems are addressed. International institution building represents one of Canada's most significant but underappreciated contributions to global governance. Canadian civil servants, diplomats, and experts have played founding roles in creating many of the international organizations that manage global cooperation today. The United Nations system includes many institutions that were significantly shaped by Canadian thinking and leadership. Canadian legal experts helped draft key UN documents. Canadian military officers helped establish peacekeeping procedures. And Canadian administrators helped design institutional structures. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors nuclear proliferation and promotes peaceful nuclear technology, was significantly influenced by Canadian nuclear expertise and diplomatic leadership. Canada's early nuclear program provided technical knowledge that shaped international nuclear governance. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, includes Canadian contributions to economic policy research, statistical standards, and governance indicators that influence policy discussions worldwide. Canadian economic expertise helps shape international economic policy debates. The G7 and G20 mechanisms for economic coordination among major economies have been significantly influenced by Canadian diplomatic skills and policy expertise. Canada's ability to work with both developed and emerging economies makes us valuable participants in these forums. Academic and research institutions provide another channel for Canadian influence that operates below the radar of traditional international relations. Canadian universities, think tanks, and research institutions contribute ideas and expertise that shape international policy discussions. The University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development, and other Canadian institutions train future leaders from around the world while contributing research that influences policy debates. Canadian expertise in areas like federalism, multiculturalism, and resource management is studied and emulated by other countries facing similar challenges. The Canadian model for managing diversity, balancing regional interests, and governing resource-rich economies influences policy discussions worldwide. Civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations based in Canada play important roles in shaping international debates on human rights, environmental protection, and social justice. These organizations benefit from Canada's reputation for fairness and competence. The private sector provides another channel for Canadian influence through companies and business leaders who are trusted partners in international commercial relationships. Canadian mining companies, financial institutions, and consulting firms often serve as intermediaries in complex international business arrangements. However, maintaining and expanding Canada's soft power influence requires strategic investments and policy choices that many Canadians don't fully appreciate. Diplomatic capacity represents the most critical investment for maintaining Canadian influence. Our diplomatic service needs continued investment in training, technology, and international presence to compete with countries that are expanding their diplomatic capabilities. Foreign aid and development assistance, while representing less than 1% of government spending, provides a central foundation for Canadian international influence. Development programs create relationships and demonstrate Canadian values that support broader diplomatic objectives. Cultural programs and educational exchanges help build understanding and relationships that support Canadian influence. Programs that bring international students to Canadian universities, support Canadian cultural exports, and facilitate educational exchanges create long-term relationships that benefit Canadian interests. International broadcasting and communication capabilities help ensure that Canadian perspectives reach international audiences. CBC International, Radio Canada International, and other communication platforms help maintain Canadian visibility in international debates. Research and policy development capabilities ensure that Canada can contribute expertise and ideas to international policy discussions. Investment in universities, think tanks, and policy research institutions provides the intellectual foundation for Canadian international influence. Language capabilities are essential for Canadian diplomats and officials to participate effectively in international discussions. Investment in language training, cultural competency, and regional expertise ensures that Canadian representatives can build relationships and understand local contexts. If you're finding this analysis of Canada's soft power transformation valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue producing in-depth analysis of the diplomatic and international trends that are shaping our global influence. The evolution of international power toward reputation-based influence represents one of the most significant shifts in global affairs since the end of the Cold War. Countries that can build and maintain trust will have unprecedented opportunities to shape international outcomes through facilitation and coalition building rather than coercion. Canada possesses soft power advantages that are almost impossible for other countries to replicate quickly. Our reputation for fairness, competence, and reliability has been built over decades of consistent international behavior. Our multicultural society and peaceful history provide credibility that military or economic powers often lack. But possessing soft power advantages is not the same as leveraging them strategically. Canada needs to make conscious decisions about how to use our international influence while maintaining the credibility and trustworthiness that make our influence possible. The next decade will be critical for establishing Canada's role in evolving global governance systems. The investments in diplomatic capacity, international engagement, and soft power projection we make now will determine whether Canada becomes a major influence in 21st century international relations. The choices we make will affect not just our own international position, but our ability to contribute to solutions for global challenges that require cooperative approaches. Countries that fall behind in building trust and credibility will find themselves increasingly marginalized in international discussions. Friends, we are living through a transformation in how international influence operates. While the world's attention focuses on military buildups and economic competition, the real power is shifting toward countries that can build trust, facilitate cooperation, and create solutions that work for multiple parties simultaneously. Canada has been building the ultimate form of 21st century power, the ability to be trusted by everyone. Our diplomatic history provides credibility that money cannot buy and weapons cannot create. Our multicultural society provides understanding that homogeneous nations struggle to achieve. The question isn't whether Canada can become a major influence in international affairs. We already are, through our unique ability to build trust and facilitate cooperation. The question is whether we'll have the vision and commitment to invest in the diplomatic capabilities, international relationships, and soft power projection needed to maximize our influence in an increasingly complex world. The conferences are convening, the negotiations are beginning, and the future of international cooperation is being shaped by countries that can build trust rather than impose solutions. Canada has the credibility to host those discussions, the expertise to contribute valuable ideas, and the relationships to build coalitions that achieve results. What we do with this soft power opportunity will determine not just our international influence, but our ability to contribute to solving global challenges that affect everyone's future. The quiet revolution in international power is here, and it speaks in the language of trust, competence, and reliability. Canada can either embrace our role as the invisible empire of global influence, or watch others fill the trust vacuum in international relations. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of Canada's soft power empire. What aspects of our international influence do you think are most important for global problem solving? Should we focus more on climate leadership, trade facilitation, or conflict resolution? Share your insights below, and I'll see you in the next analysis of the forces shaping our diplomatic future.